I'm amazed by this collection of work and the scale at which you are all working, and especially the ways in which these projects have responded to and become integrated with really big planning moves, really big geometries, urban geometries. And I'm interested to understand how you talk about that work and how you see the work and how you balance the response to the scale of those geometries and the shifts downward. Peter, you talked a lot about oases and blocking out the city and making places that are almost differentiated from the city, and yet they share geometries at the scale of the city. And I think that's true of all of the work, and I'm interested just to have you each talk a little more about that, about how you manage that relationship.
I think particularly in the projects that I talked about, it was pretty clear in the Grébert plan that it was a series of gardens within a garden. And that when you're talking about the scale of something as grand as the Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Fairmount Park, that kind of automatically sets up this both large-scale urban stroke, but also the ability to have, similar to what you said, the little eddies of gardens. And, you know, when you think about the Rodin, it's just a little jewel box of a museum. So I think it kind of sets itself up in that regard. And our responsibility, I think, as landscape architects is to respect the structure and to make the best of the time and funding and ability to transform a big place of project at a time.
I think in the projects that I was speaking about, there's sort of two examples. The Lurie Garden was really, there was a big park there with a lot of big things, and the goal there was to, or the challenge there was to go in and really frame out and define a smaller space. It's about 3.5 acres. There are a lot of great things going on around it, and how we start to frame that space, I said connect it up through, but use the things like in that case, the planting elements like the hedge to really set up a kind of frame, use the topography to make it a unique space. That was one kind of challenge. In Cleveland and Nashville, they were two obviously larger spaces that over time, because I think of the intrusion of the automobile and the sort of decline in the vision of what maintenance was, a kind of dumbing down of things, any kind of scale that had existed in a variety of scales had gradually been kind of maintained out of existence. So they just had kind of big open spaces, which in some ways they were happy with because they could do big open things. But they had trouble doing several things at once. They had trouble getting flexibility. So in that case, it was, in both of those cases, the proposals have been, how do we go back in and start to develop ways, methods to, and geometries to start to define those up. And Cleveland was initially to really reinstate those promenades to make it a big pedestrian way and to really downplay the car and put the people back in there. Similar in Nashville was some way too to get the car out a little bit, put people back in the center, and develop a series of scales where then we could accommodate some of these competing programs.
Lenny Mirren, my professor of American landscape history at Cornell, he contaminated me with Lawrence Halprin and Dan Kiley. And some of the best projects I've ever seen are Fountain Plaza in Dallas and Freeway Park in Seattle. And this just to say that also in modern American urban landscape architecture, the scale, the idea of estranging the visitor from the street into another world and bring him in another state of mind, and especially for Freeway Park in another scale, is of all times. And you see that actually in Italian Renaissance gardens. Think about the delicious Villa Lante, but many other projects. I think it responds to a need of the human brain that the city creates a pressure on our nervous system. It is a bombardment of visual things that go on, noise, and the juxtaposition of our world of green spaces compensates. It's such an unbelievable compensation. So I think it's from all times.
If people have questions, come on right up to the mic, and let me just pose one more. I'm interested in when you are out speaking to clients, civic organizations, cities, politicians, and you're trying to support your work, you're trying to build an argument for it. Do you feel that that has changed the way you speak about it over the last number of years? Going back to where I started with the question, it's very easy just to say, well, it's green, so it's good. Who's going to argue with a park? It's much better than a parking lot. But do we have to justify the work at a different level now? Are we actively engaged in that? Or is it still enough just to say, it's a park, how could you argue?
I think one of the more frustrating things, and I think probably everybody in this room has had this experience of going into a city meeting or a community meeting with something that you think really needs to be done, and they say, oh no, but then there'll be more homeless. Don't make it nice, then people will come. And so it's like, okay, let's just have crap everywhere. And, you know, I think that the thing it does to make me talk is to not be quite so rude. But I do think that we do have to talk about civic improvements and public spaces in a very different way, because there's the not in my backyard, even if you're making my backyard better. So.
I think in our work, it's, you're right, Eric, and we've talked a little bit about this before in leading up to this conference. Green is good now, but green's quickly becoming a very low common denominator. Green's better than, anything green is better than whatever you had there before. Frequently that's turning into anything green and slopey is better than any kind of architectural wall I might be able to design, or that an architect might be able to design. So green's become the answer for a lot of things. And it looks good and it sells well. What we try to do then, and difficulty is we try to get to the table first, because if you don't, sometimes people can get so enamored of a green sloping thing that does one thing, it looks nice, it's green. It may do some things from a sustainable standpoint, but it doesn't do a lot of other things that landscape needs to do in the city. So we start to talk about other things too. We talk about very simple things like connections, physical connections, visual connections. And we talk a lot about the healthy city and creation of habitat. Lurie Garden, a lot of that planting was to create habitat because it was situated over a flyway, and we've talked about other things today, people have mentioned that. Bringing that kind of vitality and life into a city. Making things walkable and accessible to a broad range of people. So it's not just a set of steps or a very 45-degree angle slope, in architecture speak, connecting something up to another green slope. So we talk about health, we talk about activity, we try to talk about it as a stage or a framework for this kind of diversity of programs for people and the kind of things that people want to do as they're as we said earlier at the beginning of the conference, moving back into the city, that people want to do a lot of different things, and the landscapes need to respond to that. And I think that's what starts to make them more modern or contemporary now, is that it's not the kind of one specific, like it's not just the parade ground, it's something now, parade ground that on Sunday becomes a farmer's market, and during the summer season becomes something else, a series of sports fields or something. The flexibility and the dynamics that I think a landscape and a horticultural component can start to really provide. I think that's where we try to get it, to get people's eyes to light up about, wow, it can be so much more.
Eric, I find that a difficult question. We have so little illusions about the intellectual capacities of our politicians that we are so the Tuileries were such a sobering experience for us in about lack of maintenance, which was promised to us, lack of guardians with 20 miles worth, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, yeah? 20 miles times, you can look in the latest catalogs of auctions, and nevertheless there are no guards. We are sobered. So we talk to politicians with constantly no illusions about how it will be maintained after that certain mayor is gone. So we talk with an idea of robustness and simplicity.
Yeah, I have a question. Susan, you just brought up, you just mentioned the homeless population. And I actually have been doing a little bit of work with downtown Berkeley, and we have professional homeless people there. And I would just like to hear from the panel your experience working in these urban areas about how to reclaim certain areas and have it be for everyone in the city, be it homeless people or professionals working in the neighborhoods. If there's any experience that you've had with that, and how do you answer that question to a panel when it comes up?
Well, I think I kind of neglected to give the more proper response to my frustration, in that the way that we typically talk about it, or like to talk about, or need to talk about it, is really one of that the landscape is the most democratic space that we have, especially public landscapes. It is that common ground. And when you improve it or make it the common ground, it's common for everybody. It's landscapes that do not exclude people, that don't pander to one type of population. And I think that's really part of the basis of our design, is that public landscapes are public, and they are democratic, and they are for everybody.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to pick up on some of the comments that Mr. Wirtz made. I was a little bit surprised to hear your depiction of how diminished landscape architects view themselves in Europe today, in part because here in the U.S., I think that's definitely been part of the story over the last several decades, but over the last few years, I think there's been a shift in that, in that relationship. But in particular, in Berlin, my understanding is that Berlin has a fairly rich tradition of urban greening. And one example of that is a policy called the biotope area factor, which basically is my understanding is a citywide policy that establishes the minimum amount of vegetation that a given site has to contain. And so I was wondering if you could just comment on that, and that dovetails to the topic that came up earlier today around citywide policy. Has the biotope area factor had any impact on landscape architecture and on greening and just that whole relationship?
Well, Berlin is one of the better examples. Berlin in Europe, Berlin, Barcelona, it has not spread in the rest of Europe, unfortunately. But it's also quite, if you see, it's all quite neglected in Berlin. I love Berlin because it has a certain orderly, lack of order, sort of sloppiness, which I sort of like. But no, it's quite an isolated phenomenon, yeah, unfortunately. You know, in Holland, some things are moving. In Holland, there is great research for adapted street tree plantings.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead.
guess I did. I'm a tree planter in a small village on Long Island, and I guess my question for the panel comes out of what Peter Wirtz said about the paucity of selection in nurseries. And this is really a policy question for me about urban arboriculture. We're living in second nature, so how do we encourage nurseries, tree nurseries particularly, to have a flexible metric about growing more kinds of trees so that we don't just have plain trees available? So what strategies, what tricks have you all used to encourage people to grow trees like Prunus serotina, which would be nice in my village, which I certainly can't find?
Ask and ask and ask again, and look at them with really dirty looks, and they get the message, and they start to grow things. It's amazing. Because if you ask and you ask and you re-ask 4 years in a row, they say, oh, that guy is stubborn, they must really mean it. And they start to ask, where can I come to take cuttings of it so I can grow it for you? Yeah. In America particularly, I'm stunned of the lack of crab apples with long trunks as standard trees. I'm also stunned about the lack of availability of other lindens than greenspire. So that don't look like a broomstick canopy, but with this, I mean, there are many very good lindens in America, and the nursery business wants to push you into greenspire. I hate greenspire.
Me too.
I think one of the strategies that we use is that I never go to a nursery without asking the growers to show me around. And when I see a whole lot of something, I say, why are you growing so much of that? And then I also ask them, what are you growing that nobody's using? And it at least opens the conversation, and then say, well, what do you need? And then it does open the conversation. And say, why don't you grow this?
There may be a parallel, too, in some areas of the country, kind of like parallel to the slow food movement there. I think some smaller native nurseries that are starting to grow things, and if you can find those resources, you might not get a whole street full of trees, but you might start to get some of those trees, and some of those nurseries will start to be able to satisfy that, but at a much smaller scale. But at least I think that's a start, how that starts to work.
I feel like I have a captive audience for what I'm going to say, in that at lunchtime I found I had an email from the Friends of the Rail Park in Philadelphia, which is our dream of the High Line in New York. It won't be elevated, but it's a banded Philadelphia-Reading rail line. And apparently the City of Philadelphia Planning Commission is finalizing their draft for the Philadelphia 2035 Central District Plan, with no funds for this wonderful linear park that would unite communities that is already there unused. So would I ask you all to send an email to Laura.Spina, S-P-I-N-A, at phila, P-H-I-L-A,